The more I study history, the more I learn about its pedagogical purposes. The fact that it teaches us many lessons. If you don't learn from it, you're doomed to repeat it. That's not the main reason to learn about it, but studying the human condition shows us where we came from, where we are, and maybe even where we are going. And it has many, many lessons that it can impart to us about our situations, both past and present. When we look to the present, the past can give us answers. That is absolutely the case, and the more I study it, the more I learn that to be true. And it is certainly true with the most recent economic and cultural developments in the United States. Donald Trump imposing several huge tariffs, reciprocal tariffs he claims, have led to outrage and panic in the media and market alike, as many believe the United States, as well as the global economy, will be so negatively impacted that a great recession, if not a depression, perhaps one even worse than that of the 1930s, will ensue. The reciprocal tariffs, wait, that's not the right image. Okay, that's better. Were implemented this weekend and include massive tariffs on huge trading partners such as South Korea, Japan, China, and many European Union countries. The market reaction was absolutely full of panic, outrage, and frustration, as many consider this to be some of the worst economic decision-making that a president has made in the last century. And indeed, with the taxes on imports being the highest in a century and the highest since the Great Depression, many have believed that that is exactly what Trump's decisions will cause. But the history of the Great Depression, as with so many other amazing events, can teach us many lessons. Before we learn that history, so hopefully we can avoid it, let me start off by saying that the history of President Trump himself contributes to this. Contemporarily, President Trump ran on a platform of neo-protectionism in all three of his presidential elections, preferring huge taxes on imports rather than large trade deficits with many trading partners, China especially. And before the COVID-19 pandemic sent the world into lockdown and economic retreat, trade wars with China seemed to be the future of the United States foreign economic policy. However, the parties seemingly had flipped, the Democrats embracing free trade while the Republicans running away from it, a cornerstone of their free market economics, as neo-protectionism became quite popular under President Trump, who continued to wield great influence on American politics and on the Republican Party especially, changing it for better or for worse. Yet these contemporaneous political, social, economic, and historical developments, however muddled and complex they might be, pale in comparison to the complexity of the Great Depression, wherein the American economy collapsed between 1929 and 1941, only to rebound in fits and starts until the war machine and the drafting of soldiers for World War II brought it roaring back to levels that eclipsed even its apex in the 1920s. The 1920s had indeed been the Roaring Twenties, a time of great consumer confidence, prosperity, the growth of wealth for both the rich and poor alike, low unemployment, and laissez-faire economics with low tax policies advocated by the Harding and Coolidge administrations. The extreme levels of buying and loaning on credit, including buying stocks on margin, had worried the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was a miner who had made his fortune during World War I and then led huge relief efforts that had saved millions of lives. He was also the 1928 shoo-in for the presidential nomination, and despite his warnings and protestations, the markets continued to be unperturbed by the government after his election to the presidency. However, in October of 1929, the economic bubble burst, with stocks eventually collapsing completely and crashing on Black Tuesday, October 29th. Billions of dollars were lost in value, companies collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, and people seeking to get as much funds as they could in order to survive the long months ahead rushed to the banks, withdrawing money at a breakneck pace that led the banks to collapse, running out of funds themselves. Suddenly, the American economy was destroyed. Production dipped. People were starving. Unemployment hit 25%. Banks did not have enough money, and the need for government intervention in order to restabilize the economy seemed absolutely mandatory. Mortgages were called in at an alarming rate, with millions losing their homes as well as their jobs, businesses, and livelihoods. The runs on the banks would not stop, however, and the banks did not have enough money, with thousands of them closing. The Federal Reserve froze the nation's currency supply, leading to austerity and deflation. At the same time, the only thing that seemed to be on the rise were the amount of soup kitchens and people taking their own lives. Protests, soup kitchens, relief efforts, and those desperately looking for the job crowded the streets. Meanwhile, the painful economic lesson was coupled with a painful leadership lesson for Herbert Hoover, who refused to get the government involved, believing that charitable organizations and developments, a system known as voluntarism, would solve the day. This, despite the fact that Hoover had not caused the Great Depression and had even warned against the frivolous spending and lending that had led to the Great Depression in the first place, would not soothe the suffering of the millions of American people who now turned on him, developing an entire lexicon of disdain for the man they had once overwhelmingly elected as their president. Hoover flags were empty pockets turned inside out. Hoovervilles were shanty towns, ramshackle shacks from a bunch of people who had once owned homes who now blamed Hoover for their loss. He became the hatred of the entire American public, with the society blaming him overwhelmingly for the continual suffering as the Depression eked into 1931 and 1932. Hoover's solution was to protect American manufacturing, and thus protectionism became his ally, as he instituted the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 in order to protect and strengthen American businesses. This only led to more suffering, as American businesses and international ones collapsed alike. And although tariffs had not caused the Great Depression, they did not help it, and were one piece of the puzzle that Hoover could not solve. But there was a man offering to solve the issues, both for the United States and for the growing suffering in Europe, which relied on American businesses such as Great Britain and Germany and France. Franklin Roosevelt was the Democratic governor of New York, and an amazing story. Originally, the vice presidential candidate in 1920, he had been stricken with polio and had overcome his disability to become governor of New York and be a face of the franchise, a charismatic, kind, and interested man who promised to get the government involved to solve the problems that Hoover had so blatantly failed at. He promised a new deal for the American people, in which the government would work for them. This optimism, shininess, and charisma contrasted with the unlikable Hoover, who, continuing to try to push the Sisyphus-like rock of individualism up the mountain, did not seem to be the cure that the American people, nor the world at large, needed. Franklin Roosevelt filled those shoes instead, and became the obvious choice to win in 1932. Meanwhile, foreign countries continued to alarm America's foreign policy issues. With the rise of fascist dictatorships like that of Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany in the face and answer of economic decline, Franklin Roosevelt brought optimism and won overwhelmingly in one of the biggest landslides in American history in 1932. He would go on to win 3 more landslides, a record for any president, and Hoover left the office in disgrace, continuing to protest his innocence. Roosevelt got to work on the New Deal programs that would be the definitive linchpin of his domestic policies while president. He created the Social Security Administration in order to give senior citizens the relief they needed. In addition, he created unemployment insurance and other forms of compensation for those suffering. More than anything, his New Deal is best known for the alphabet soup. The CCC, WPA, NRA, TVA. These different relief efforts and domestic programs employed millions of Americans for temporary times, although they often clashed with the interests of the rich and the Supreme Court. It was all part of the 3 R's of Roosevelt's efforts: relief, recovery, and reform. And the New Deal programs of 1933 were backed up by the New Deal programs of 1934, such as Social Security and, like I said before, unemployment insurance. Manufacturing and employment started to improve, but they did not reach 1920s levels until World War II, as aforementioned. Roosevelt, however, gave a new vision. By insuring the banks by creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Committee, the FDIC, he gave hope to many Americans, but many still suffered. Unemployment was still high, and a series of droughts in the plains, Midwest, and Southwest led to the Dust Bowl, in which the poorest of the poor were forced into horrifying living conditions, living in shacks, trying to get westward for new opportunities in places like California. But Roosevelt's optimism and hope inspired the American people. He talked to them in a way they could understand. Using radio as his greatest ally, he spoke to the American people in a series of fireside chats, and with the media as his best friends partnering with the Democratic Party, not for the first time, Franklin Roosevelt brought hope to the American people. His activity, frequently vetoing bills, issuing executive orders, and creating new laws almost out of nowhere, brought stability to an America that was suffering. The FDIC insured the banks, and the banks were reopened. And Roosevelt became the symbol of hope and optimism as the Great Depression started to wane, yet continued to stir. It was only the growth of the American war machine in response to the aggression of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, and eventually the U.S. involvement in the war, that would bring America out of the depths of the Great Depression and to soaring new heights not even foretold in the 1920s. This foreign interventionism would lead the American economy to its greatest days and would make Franklin Delano Roosevelt considered among one of its greatest presidents. Despite the fact that his domestic policies had not worked, his interventionist policies had brought the American economy roaring back. The release of the American manufacturing helped the U.S. not only win the war, but come to dominate the global economy and military sphere throughout the following decades. It also created a level of interdependence between the global economies of that time and our time today, the global economy that now might be challenged by neo-protectionism and by tariffs. At the same time, Franklin Roosevelt's policies did not solve the Great Depression, but perhaps better than anything, they prevented a future Great Depression, as the American economy has not slipped back into one. Tariffs were not the responsibility of the Great Depression, but they weren't exactly helpful. And who knows what kind of economic woes may come about because of their implementation in a much more globalized economy. At the same time, it was not economic worry, concern, or protectionism that caused the Great Depression. It was the opposite. Overconfidence and arrogance can lead to the destruction of any political or economic system, no matter how successful it has been. And that was certainly the case of America in the late 1920s. And it may certainly be the case of America or any other global network with such great economic dominance in the 21st century as well as in the 20th. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, a little bit of history, politics, economics, kind of all over the place today, but really enjoyed making this video and doing some research and just thought it was extremely relevant. So if you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment and some feedback. Consider my Patreon for bonus content. And I release videos every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and early access on my Patreon. So consider all of that stuff. I really appreciate you tuning in. I hope you have a great day. Enjoy your week, and I'll see you again. Love history.